So we're interested in individual differences, and I would like to hear everyone's opinion. And please just switch on your microphone and start talking because I cannot see everyone. So my first question is, as I mentioned briefly, Kurt Lewin was in 1920s was trying to promote the idea that a model or a theory is not a good one if it can only explain means, as we typically try to do, but not also with the same mechanisms can explain variability. And that actually, I'm distinguishing between intra and inter-individual later. But how would you react to this? What do you think about this? Could or should this be a new challenge to judging the quality of models, or is this asked too much? Any opinion on this? Do you care?
Well, I mean, it certainly makes sense to leave room for that. And come to think of it, I'm still thinking about it while I'm saying this, but I think there's quite a number of models who actually allow to include or to look at individual differences and to account for them. And especially coming from intervention and also developmental research, I would strongly agree that this is a very crucial aspect that we need to look at basically in everything we do, because there's so much variance in that. It can explain so much, not that we are fully understand.
Let me spice up the question a little bit. We have just seen from Yoav, we have seen some, he looked into individual differences with respect to the relationship between updating and non-updating, whether people are faster or are slower in doing one or the other. And whatever his eventual model will be, he showed us data suggesting that for some people, he cannot explain their behavior, period. So, of course, there may be random factors. It may be the intra-individual stability of these data, of these differences may not be high. So next time he tests them, may be different, but who knows? So how good can a theory be, a model be, if it fails to explain, let's say, 20, 30, 40% of the people that you're testing?
Well, I think maybe 40 is a little too much. But if there's, let's say, I don't know, 15% of the data theory cannot explain, I wouldn't actually be too concerned about that, because the people we test are not behaving like machines. There will always be variance that is related to, I don't know, their daily performance, their motivation, their just maybe a lack of attention, something that brings noise into the data. And so I don't think it's realistic to expect that a theory can explain 100% of the data. If it's only 60%, I'd agree there's room for improvement, but I think we have to leave some room for things we can't explain, because it's actually humans we are researching.
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly the standard account, right? And I'm just wondering whether it is too lame and too easy to be used. Because first of all, we do not care. So it could be that this is correct. It could be that next time I'm testing this guy, he shows different behavior, but I'm not even trying. I do not even want to know. And this is what I think what most of us are characterized by. We kind of move it on the side easily, and I wonder whether perhaps too easily. And again, I'm not saying that we must never publish papers about models that cannot explain 100%. Okay, then we have very little to publish. But at least the ambition could be there. And I do not see any of those ambitions even. So of course, if we would share this ambition, if we would say that, let's say, the ability to not only explain differences, or let's say means, but also variability, should count as, let's say, one feature in a comparison. So let's say if Tim is making his model and I'm making a different model, and he can explain some variability, and I cannot, perhaps we should consider his model better than mine. This is the type of thinking that I'm just suggesting. I don't know. Perhaps this is totally wrong and off track, but I wonder whether we should perhaps start thinking this way.
I do like your way of thinking, but at least you're also explaining some of this, so you can build up on the theory. And this is also something that has been puzzling me for quite a while. So going back to also my field with schizophrenia, why is it that some people experience an elevated sense of agency, whereas some other have this reduced sense of agency when we're talking about this very same F20 diagnosis? Talking about the rubber hand illusion, why are there always some non-responders? So, and I saw there's this also common practice to maybe also separate them into some that respond to that some do not respond to that, and build the analysis on top of that, and then trying on the way before you start running, starting to walk, working with that data that you have and developing it further and further. But it's certainly also something that has been also puzzling me, why it's sometimes even on the opposite sides of the extreme.
Yeah, one reason perhaps to explain why I'm thinking this way has indeed to do with pathology. Because if you look into, let's say, the literature on pathologies, it's almost disentangled from cognitive sciences as we look into this. Not everyone, of course, there are connections, but typically they don't care much. And they don't read what we are doing. We are not reading what they're doing, suggesting, and they come then up with, let's say, pathologies are often explained in ways that are unrelated to theorizing in cognitive basic sciences. And that, I think, cannot be, because if we are really, if I'm sure that I covered all the relevant processes or functions to explain my means in the, let's say, the basic science approach, that must be the same that somehow go wrong or astray in some other folks in order to be diagnosed with something. It's very unlikely that there is something totally different. Of course, I mean, there are examples like if you're freezing, if your whole body freezes, then your reaction times are very, very long for reasons that may not be related to the functions that I have in my model. I'm not talking about these kind of things. But if there are, let's say, if there are commonalities, and there typically are, we are typically overestimating the degree to which pathology or diagnosed people are different from healthy controls. Some healthy controls are very, very borderline, and some diagnosed people are not very, very mad, let's say. So there are close connections, and it is very unlikely that the folks in the middle are following totally different logic and mechanisms than the guys on the, let's say, across the border. That's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, I see. But I think also one of the core problems is that we not always have all the individual factors that count in. So the theory is not complete. So there are different aspects of this, but there are many, many other things that play a role. So, and this really boils down of what do you think? So if you would then in the end have all the information, all the different factors that would count in hundreds or thousands of that, so then the theory could reflect this very well. But I think in practice we don't have this. Also, when you talk about psychopathology, different medications that the people are using, different other brain chemistry, maybe some other diagnoses also play around, different inhibitory loops that might not function or that function differently in the brain. And I do believe so that we don't have all the factors, so that we only can explain a certain variance of this away. And that maybe in most of the cases, the majority is actually based on other factors that play a role as well, so that we cannot yet completely combine, and most likely also never will. And so for that, my take is that I think phenomenology is quite important. That instead, has been the critique that I have had for quite a long time. How you do this dichotomous diagnostics. Okay, F20 schizophrenia or depression. So, but when we're looking at phenomenology and then having a look, okay, what sub-dimensions of that are we interested in? Are they really scoring on these dimensions? So that we take a certain subset of people that react to that. So even if it's just 50%, okay, I think one might get some exploratory insights if we take these 50% further, and what are the common denominators, so that we process a theory further and further and further. And I really like this one saying, if the brain was so simple that we could understand it, we were too simple that we could understand it. So there's a lot of it's one of the biggest unsolved mysteries, really. And I think this is really the core of the problem, that we can never have a look at all the factors that play a role in that.
Well, I basically fundamentally disagree with almost everything you just said. We are discussing these things here repeatedly and also with Christian because, for instance, if you take pathology, and I don't want to make this only about pathology, but for me, pathology is just one way, like development. So what Ullmann Lindenberger was once telling me, if you want to understand developmental research, then you need to understand that this is about individual differences. And that I took on board. So that coming from there, pathology is just another way of looking into individual differences, because I do not believe in borders. And indeed, if you talk to psychiatrists, then everyone, if you let's say, go beyond the typical professional replies, then everyone would, or most of them would agree that first of all, we have comorbidities like tons, meaning that rarely someone comes with one pathology without bringing another, not just the same, but a different one. How can a system that is set up in organizing, the DSM book is very thick right now, right? So how can that be correct if you have so many comorbidities? Or
oh, it's not correct.
I come from or yeah. Turn it around. If you look into the real mechanisms that are totally not understood, and I think because the whole categorization started from top down, from the phenomenology. And I think this is misleading dramatically, as always, like all our understanding of consciousness is just misled by our top down approach, because we come from our conscious mind and then we categorize the world and think that the brain use the same system. No, it has no reason to follow our conscious insights and our typically language related ways to categorize things. Why would it? So if you look into the mechanisms, then what you see is whatever the pathologies, it's typically 1 or 2 or 3 neurotransmitter systems that are playing the big role in all of them. How come? And so forth and so on. So it's typically too much or too little or too inflexible and so forth and so on. So I wonder whether the brain was why we expect the brain to be busy for so many years to develop all these different pathologies only in order to make our DSM full. You know?
Yes, I totally agree.
So I think this is all bullshit, because it started from the wrong angle, and we should reconstruct things from what we know. So if we understand basic mechanisms, if we understand the impact of neurotransmitters, let's try to reconstruct pathologies from what we know. But what we know comes from typical models that are developed for the means, and hence my understanding of the connection, right? This is why I believe that explaining means and explaining deviance, if you will, should come from the same source, because we cannot leave the world to psychiatrists with their intuitions and their phenomenal misleading ideas. So that's, that's why I fundamentally disagree.
Yeah, I do agree with that, also with the DSM. So it is not that dichotomous, so yes or no answers. And also, if you have a look at these developments of what personality disorders we have, then suddenly don't have. So, and I think it's a system where I do agree with you. This is fundamentally wrong, but it makes life easier to put it into certain boxes that you can talk about it. So what kind of a rough idea do you have? But fundamentally, if you look at the different mechanisms, this is rather on the top-down approach, which is not scientifically correct, but from the whole mechanisms behind it, but which would make sense in a sense of how do you talk about this in classic psychiatry, in psychology, so that you have a good idea. And I do see some changes there also with the DSM, that they at least say it's on a continuum. It is not yes and no. It's not black and white there anymore. And so in this regard, I also think if you want to have it scientifically and from the methods and from the inner workings of the brain correctly, so then there should be a rather higher focus from the bottom up, and to really have a look what is happening, what neuroscientific evidence do we have, what does the EEG, for example, can explain, from which we can build the system up new. So I also don't like it. I'm not this big of a fan, but at the same time, it makes the life easier so that you know what are you roughly speaking about.
Yes. Yeah. You are muted, Julia. You're still.
Sorry. Now I come to think of it, actually, Bernhard, I was thinking about what you said regarding the problem that there's the whole, let's call it clinical world, and the cognitive basic science world not talking. That's actually something that inspired a research cluster that we are currently working on, focusing on emotion regulation. Because we came to talking with our clinical psychologists, and we were talking about emotion regulation as a transdiagnostic factor in psychopathology. And I looked at some of the current models of emotion regulation, and they basically scream cognitive control, because so many of the processes in the cross model, for instance, do require what we as cognitive scientists would think, yeah, well, this is cognitive control, this is executive function, and so forth. And we started doing studies together with our clinical people and looking at the interaction or even the correlates between emotion regulation and cognitive control. And the way we measure cognitive control, there's basically no stable relationship between emotion regulation. And so if you do our standard executive control tasks and correlate them, or even on the individual differences level with emotion regulation, there's nothing, which sounds really counterintuitive if you look at our models of cognitive control, regardless of which one you look at, and on at models of emotion regulation. And it's just not as simple as that. I wouldn't say all the models are wrong, but they are not, it's not as simply as we thought of putting them together. We have continued doing more studies on that, and we see that there are factors coming into play, such as the context in which you regulate your emotions, or things like how flexibly you can regulate your emotions, which again seems to be related to cognitive control, but is not in a direct way. It's mediated by other factors. So this is a very, very complex interplay of processes. And I think if you, at least from what I know now from our data, coming up with a theory that would explain that, that would have to be a very, very complicated one with many if and then rules. And obviously we are not, we are not at the end of the road. There's a lot of things we have to further look at, but this is an example for me showing that it can't be easy models that capture most of the variance. And most of our cognitive control models are relatively simple, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, that would. Pardon me?
Job, do you want to say something?
Yeah,
No,
please.
no, go ahead and answer. I have a different comment.
No, then go ahead.
Yeah. So I want to go back to your first question. So is a model that explains individual differences better than one that does not? And I think the answer is yes, generally. So the more you can explain, the better you are. And psychology is a lot of psychology is about individual differences. I do care about them, but there are two problems. So the first is the reliability of the measurement. We can measure processes very reliably at the group level and very unreliably at the individual level. And that's a huge problem. A lot of it is due to the problem of difference scores, which are highly unreliable. So if the measure, so things like Stroop or Simon or flanker effect that are highly reliable at the group level, they're highly unreliable when you try to look at retest correlations. And I think that until we solve this problem, and there are some attempts by Jeff Rauder and colleagues, Julia Haaf and so forth, but we're not yet there. But we need to solve this problem in order to move forward. We cannot, in the tools that we have right now, move to explain individual differences. That's about reliability. But I believe it's a technical problem that will be solved and quite soon, I believe. But another one is validity. So let's say in my data, right, I have some subjects that show an effect in one direction and others show an effect in the other direction. And let's assume this is reliable. So I can see this same pattern over a few sessions and so on. And now to explain individual differences, I need to look for variables that exist outside my experiment, right? I need theory. I need to understand what these differences correlate with. So it's a validity problem. So, and currently I don't have a good theory that will, tell me where to look. So I can look at the standard things like intelligence, working memory capacity, that's too general. What else? I can measure a host of other variables and hope for the best. We need theory, a general theory of individual differences in cognition.
Yes, that was another question of mine. It would be indeed where to look. So if, let's say, the first question was, should we be interested in individual differences? We have seen some pros and cons, let's say, but there's nothing wrong. I think there would be no one saying, no, we must never look there. But the next question would be, if you're interested, where to look? And there indeed, what I hear implicitly, I think from what you were saying, but I may be wrong, is that, let's say, that the generation or the generator of the individual difference stuff is separate from our own theorizing. So in other words, so the typical example would be, I remember a very long, many years ago, where there was Dave Meyer at Psychonomics talking about extraversion, introversion. So you would go to personality psychologists, you would consult them, you would say, what are suspicious, interesting traits that you can recommend? Anxiety, introversion, extroversion, likability, intelligence, I don't know what. And then we would kind of correlate that with our findings. Let's say the generator of the differences comes from outside and is not part of your own theorizing. You only say, I have this model, X, which explains the means, and there is these other people who have produced these traits, and if I and these are moderators of my effects in the following ways, blah, blah, blah. So that would still not achieve what I was, let's say, trying to provoke, namely, no, we need to theorize ourselves. And we don't need to accept, perhaps we should not accept, the categories that other people suggest, because they may suggest them for the wrong reasons. And my reasoning here is the same. It's as provocative as I just used it for pathologies. I think the personality approach is also wrong because it starts from the top-down fashion. Why? I mean, I think it is a bit less complicated than the pathology issue, and less dramatic, I think. So if you take the big five, then I think it does need some clarification still. But isn't it a problem that these people are also unwilling to come up with mechanisms? And if they are not doing this, why should we accept their theorizing? Should we not adopt perhaps the general job and make it part of our own theorizing by making it bottom up? So what we here and Christian are trying to push and push and push is to turn the whole logic of theorizing the other way around, just to start with things that we know and reconstruct, and that is the theoretical art, as it were. And if you do this, then we can very easily, so if you, I didn't think that through, but let's say if you are having this kind of working memory model and you have parameters in there that you believe are let's say, important for understanding your data, could you not think it further? Could you not just make it more and more extreme? So what if a person has, I don't know, this parameter and goes over the edge, as it were? What would happen? And then you could look whether there are people who are actually like this. So you would invent your own pathologies, as it were. This is just one example. And again, I didn't think it through. But this is what I mean by, or perhaps they're already there. And then you think, oh, that sounds like schizophrenia to me. And perhaps it doesn't cover all of the diagnostic points that the doctor has to indicate. And then I would say, so what? That's not your problem. It's their problem, because you could explain part of the problem without explaining other parts of the problem. So it's would be a different kind of thinking, mainly, what I would like to suggest. But perhaps it's not yet clear enough or something. But I just think we should be more ambitious and not take from others, but do the job ourselves. But the first thing would be, do we want this? And first, I would like to convince people that they should be more ambitious. So that's and perhaps you are telling me, well, I have other things to do. That's fine. I'm just trying, because I think it might be interesting what comes out.
I do like this idea very much, but my concern would be rather, the practical reasons how to do it in the common practice, how it's going in clinics, because it's so complex to build it all from bottom up. And do agree, so that these diagnoses basically don't exist. They can always change, and sometimes the criteria we can take the DSM and ICD. many differences on the time criterion, for example. So even how we diagnose this is actually not even uniform. And I think this makes a lot of problem and also a lot of variability that we have. So I fundamentally do agree with the bottom-up approaches and see what do we have there? What fixed biomarkers can we build it up on? But yeah, my concern is really the practicality behind it.
Yeah.
I think that you're assuming that the factors that drive individual differences are the same factors that drives behavior or internal processes.
Exactly.
And it's not necessarily the case, right? So look at the executive functions literature. So executive functions are all about individual differences, right? Why some people are better than others in shifting or inhibition or updating tasks, right? And I think that many times people mix between these statistical concepts, right, or individual differences concepts and internal processes. We know today that there's no single process called inhibition or shifting or updating. These are general abilities. So you can't really infer. These are different levels of explanations. And I'm not sure that the same rules apply in both of them, or the same mechanisms are, would be able to explain differences in both of them. So I think we should be at least modest in this respect, you know.
Could be. Yeah, well, again, I mean, this is a theoretical discussion. In general, I'm just extremely dissatisfied with the state of our science. And I think about, first of all, why that is and what one can do about it. And this is part of this endeavor. And it may be not the most easy, not the most plausible, or whatever, but I think it is. So, for instance, also the fact that our processes, we all think that all these processes exist only for our individual paradigm. And I think this is extremely unlikely for a brain to think this way or to develop this way over the centuries or decades or longer periods, thousands of years. Why would it care? And why should there be, only because there is this very complicated memory task, why should there be one dedicated process that only cares about this particular task, even though it was developed or built into the brain millions of years before it knew that such a task exists? But this is how this is a cartoonish model, obviously, but this is how we deal with it. We don't even try to trace the processes our work implies across different paradigms. We don't care, because these are people who are publishing in a different journal. So what does working memory have to do with visual search? What does visual search have to do with the attentional blink? Well, nothing, because the stimulus is always in the same location. This is not a satisfying answer. So things like that, this is what worries me. And I think we diverge so that we have now thousands of different paradigms, and they will never come back. They will never come to let's say, to meet again. But there will be more and more. And I'm sure that let's say, after your memory task, in 5 years, there will be other younger people who will divide that into two different, even more complicated tasks that are measuring more processes and make models even more complex. And I'm trying to think about, how could we return this? How could we get things together again? Because the brain, Tim was saying, the brain is incredibly complicated. I have the opposite idea. I think we make it complicated by not bringing together the things that the brain should do from our perspective by not caring about what other people are asking. And that's why, in the reality, I would believe the brain is much simpler than we think, but we are not investigating it in a way that this would be a possible outcome of our research. We just make it seem more complicated. Anyway, perhaps we take that up on a different occasion or not, but I certainly will keep thinking about it. I think it was interesting to see some problems that you raised, some difficulties, certainly for these people important, because I always keep pushing them into the other direction. So now they have better arguments to withstand and decline my what I'm asking them for. But anyway, I'm grateful that you guys participated. Again, these are not the best conditions. It's always nicer to kind of see people face to face. But this is the best we could do. It still feels a little bit pandemic to me, to be honest. But perhaps in a certain sense it is, because our world is not in the best state currently, and there is room for improvement. Anyway, so it's good that you took part in this endeavor. I thank everyone here and there in the outer space. And I certainly try to see you in person again on one occasion or another, perhaps even here in Jinan. So let's see what we can do, and keep strong and keep up with the good work. And thanks to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having us.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.